On part 2 of Chicago's Jewish West Side, we take a look at 6 synagogues that are now churches. 3 are in the West Garfield Park area and 3 are in Austin. And I stepped foot in them in either the 1950s or 1960s when they were still synagogues. The first on our list is Congregation Hagro Anshe Wilna. From the 1920s until the early 1950s, the synagogue was located at the corner of Springfield and Congress Parkway. The arrow with the number 1 in it pointing down is the location, 3900 West Congress Parkway. However, the congregation was forced to move when the site was needed for the construction of the Congress Expressway. So it moved 1 block east and a few blocks north on Hamlin just past Jackson Boulevard. The arrow pointing to the right with the number 2 in it shows the exact location. Earlier that same year, a new rabbi was installed as the spiritual leader, Solomon Zaman. This is what the corner location of Springfield and Congress Parkway looks now. Considering that only the first 2 buildings on the block have been rebuilt, one wonders why the Highway Commission demanded the takeover. We jump to Jackson and Hamlin with the camera facing west on Jackson Boulevard. We quickly pan to the right to go north a few doors down to where the replacement synagogue was located. The Jewish Star is still seen near the top of the building. One year in the late 1950s, my father was cantor in the auxiliary high holiday services. This was for the overflow crowd who didn't want to pay for the higher priced tickets in the main service. It later merged with Congregation Mikdosh El in Evanston on Dodge near Howard, but the joint congregation closed up about 10 years ago. I vaguely recall walking with my mother here on this 3800 block west from our apartment on the 4400 block west of Jackson Boulevard. This side street here is Adams. The next one over to the right is Wilcox. On the 3900 block of Wilcox once stood the Chicago Jewish Academy, a co-ed high school that in its 3rd move is now in a modern facility in Skokie and been renamed the Ida Crown Jewish Academy. A public school now stands on the Wilcox location. Our next stop is the corner at the 4200 block of Adams at Keeler, 4 blocks west of here. Here we are at the corner of Adams and Keeler. It's fair to say that that traffic circle was not there in the 1950s. Its official name was Ache Yavne Synagogue, which stands for the Brothers of Yavne, but it was also known simply as the Adams and Keeler Shul. The spiritual leader was Rabbi Shlomo Rappaport, and he was also the principal at the Chicago Jewish Academy. It was easy enough to devote time to both jobs properly, as the buildings were only 3 blocks apart. Our next stop was a synagogue that was around the corner from our apartment on the 4400 block of West Jackson Boulevard. Number 1 on this map is where we are just leaving. Number 2 is the apartment building where we lived. And number 3 is the synagogue, which is located on the 4400 block of West Gladys. The first building on the right, just past this alley, was home to Congregation B'nai Sholem of Garfield Park. Because of its proximity to our apartment, this is the congregation we mostly attended. I vaguely remember several times cutting through that alley from Jackson, instead of walking another 30 or 40 feet east to Costner, and using the relative safety and cleanliness of the sidewalk. Rabbi Nathan Weiss was the spiritual leader of this congregation. After it disbanded when the neighborhood changed in the early 1960s, the rabbi was able to get a job with another synagogue in Skokie. I still remember my older sister and I playing with the rabbi's children either out in front or in the basement of the synagogue during the services. I remember one time when the president of the synagogue, Mr. Becker, was sitting on the dais and motioned me to come forward so that he can either give me a cracker or a candy, but I didn't understand why. These are the three synagogues in West Garfield Park. But there are two others of which I have little information. This white building in the 1920s was listed as Achenu B'nai Yisrael, which means we the brothers of the children of Israel. There is also the possibility that this small building on Sacramento Avenue just south of Madison Street was called Occidental Hall and was used for Jewish religious purposes. We next turn our attention to the Austin neighborhood. Here is a map that gives you a view of where we lived as well as the three synagogues in the Austin neighborhood during the 1960s. The location labeled number 1 towards the middle and the bottom of the screen was for Congregation B'nai Israel of Austin. Location number 2, which is just above it and to the left, is where our family lived on the middle of the block of Quincy between Central and Lotus. Location number 3 was the site of the Austin Jewish Community Center, and all the way in the top left, site number 4, was the Central Hebrew Congregation. So let's take our imaginary trip from West Garfield Park down to Austin. If you recall, the B'nai Shalom of Garfield Park Synagogue was on Gladys next to an alley. So visualize taking that alley walk back to Jackson Boulevard and going west to the middle of the block where we lived. This empty lot is all that remains of the memories that we have of the apartment building that we lived in from 1955 to 1959. We then moved to the Austin neighborhood about 1.5 miles down the road. So let's get in our car and head west on Jackson Boulevard, along with a little traveling music. We've done a time lapse to get us to our next destination. Coming up on the left is Congregation B'nai Israel of Austin. The spiritual leader of this congregation was Rabbi Shlomo Z. Feinberg. This was probably the oldest Jewish institution in the Austin neighborhood. The building here on the left was the main sanctuary, and on the right was the auxiliary social hall and classrooms building. In the early 1960s, my father was the cantor for the high holiday services in the social hall. Later, he was hired as the cantor for services that required special events such as a bar or bat mitzvah. Once I was bar mitzvahed at age 13, I volunteered to be the regular Torah reader for the afternoon services on Saturday. Rabbi Feinberg hailed from Memphis, Tennessee, and had been installed as the rabbi in 1944 and stayed there until the synagogue disbanded at the end of 1968. He was a stern, imposing figure in black robes and tolerated no chatting whatsoever during services. The next synagogue on our tour is 1 block west and about 1.5 blocks at the most north from here. So we'll just speed on down the block to get to Central, hang a right and go north. This is the Austin Jewish Community Center. The spiritual leader was Rabbi Louis J. Learfield. The stairs and the doors are still the same ones as they were 50 years ago, but the facade has changed. Any acknowledgement of its Jewish origins has been eliminated. Austin Jewish Community Center was known for its annual bazaar that was held on the upper floor social hall. There was excitement for all. Doodads, gadgets, clothes, appliances, games, and the ever-loving food. The synagogue owned the mansion-like building that was at the corner of Adams, a half a block to the left. During the daytime, that building housed the Rambam Jewish Day School, which was a coeducational religious grammar school, and in the afternoon it had its own afternoon Hebrew school for those kids who went to the public school. By the way, B'nai Israel of Austin had its own Hebrew school. The final stop on this tour is a couple blocks to the north next to Washington Boulevard on Central. We're coming up to and are just about passing Madison Street. West on Madison, on the north side of the street, was Diamond's Kosher Bakery. East on Madison, on the south side of the street, was Sinofsky's and Wetzler's Kosher Butcher. Here is Central Hebrew Congregation. Its other name was Congregation Anshe Shavel Yanova. The only spiritual leader this synagogue had was Rabbi Louis J. Chaimovitz. This congregation was previously at 16th and Holman in the Lawndale area. It moved to this location in the early 1950s. When our family joined this congregation in 1959, the building had a totally different look. It was more like an old mansion. In the early 1960s, it had a significant makeover to the way the building looks now. The only difference is that the facade consisted of turquoise-colored bricks, and there were two huge Ten Commandment tablets adorning the center, along with several frosted windows that went from the bottom to the top of the building. About 75% of our synagogue attendance was done here. I was bar mitzvahed here. Rabbi Chaimovitz was a very endearing person and sometimes felt like more of a family member. Well, this takes us through our tour of the synagogues of West Garfield Park in Austin. There will be upcoming episodes of other synagogues in the Great West Side of Chicago.